Well, Dr. Tony Evans, it is always such an honor to chat with you. And today we're talking about your new book, Oneness Embraced, A Kingdom Race Theology for Reconciliation, Unity, and Justice. That title alone stops you in your tracks. Just so powerful. So tell me what inspired this book and why you wrote it.
Well, it was about 10 years ago when we were concerned about the issue of unity, and I wrote the book Oneness Embraced, but so much has happened in these recent years to reignite the disunity in the culture, racially, politically, socially, economically, that we wanted to speak into the current scenarios that are dividing us from a bibliocentric perspective. And so we developed the concept of KRT, Kingdom Race Theology, since so much talk is about CRT, critical race theory, and to give a biblical framing for unity, why it matters, what it is, and how it works.
Why has it gotten so much worse over the last decade or so? We're the church. We're supposed to be speaking truth into the culture. So why has it only gotten worse?
It has gotten worse because we've been more cultural Christians than biblical Christians. Our identity is to be rooted in the imago Dei, in the image of God. But we've gotten so ingrained in the thinking of the culture that what we wind up is being parakeets to what the society is saying, rather than taking a solid, loving, but clear stand on what God is saying. From womb to tomb, God identifies the person as a bearer of the image of God. So much so that James 3:9 says you can't even curse a person because they are created in the image of God, which means the dignity of every human being is to be held in the highest standard, lest you insult God. And when you understand that that is how God made us and that is how he wants us to relate, God is not colorblind. He's just not blinded by color. He recognizes and has created the uniquenesses of the cultures in which we are born and the ethnicities, but he never wants that to be the deciding factor for decision-making in our lives.
It's really good. You talk about in your book why it's so dangerous to marry our faith with the American flag. Talk more about this, because we've been seeing this be a really big issue in recent years especially.
Well, what you wind up creating is a civil religion, and you become and that becomes idolatry. Whenever your national allegiance, and we should have national allegiance, but whenever that national allegiance causes you to have non-Christian perspectives underneath the flag, then what you have done is you've created a national idol that God must resist, reject, and judge. And I think one of the things we're facing now is the judgment on America because the failure of the church to be the people of God that represents his kingdom more than we represent the nation.
So how are we seeing this judgment kind of play out today?
Well, 2 Chronicles 15, 3-6, it says there was no peace in the land. In the individuals, family, that their city rose up against city and nation rose up against nation, for God caused them all kind of distress. Romans 1 talks about the fact that when we remove ourselves from God, verse 24, 26, and 28 says, God removes himself from us. So what we're seeing now is conflict, and the conflict is the judgment, because God has been removed and the idolatry of culture, nationalism, and race has replaced God's primacy in our lives. He's allowing the conflict until it gets so bad that we wake up and look up.
How can we get to a point as a church where we embrace this kingdom agenda? Because it seems like in some ways we're pretty far gone.
We are pretty far gone. Verse 4 of 2 Chronicles 15 says, in their distress, they sought the Lord and he let them find him. So what God does is he lets things continually decline until we get desperate enough to return to his standard. And his standard is biblical unity. And biblical unity is oneness of purpose, not sameness of persons. Whenever you have a football team, we got 11 different positions, but there's only one goal line. God has one goal line, and that's his kingdom. And his kingdom is his divine rule. And he wants to rule and overrule our ethnicity. He wants to rule and overrule our skin color. He wants to rule and overrule our human relationships when they get in the way of his divine standard. So there must be a radical return to biblical truth, biblical standards, and biblical unity. In John chapter 17, verses 23 to 25, Jesus says, perfect them in unity so they will see my glory. See, God is one God composed of three co-equal persons who's one in essence and distinct in personality. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, but they're all tied together by the same divine nature. In other words, the Godhead is unified. So whenever God is seeing disunity, he keeps himself away because he can't be himself because of his unified nature. So we're actually praying, preaching, and having worship service while telling God he's not invited because of our illegitimate disunity, which means we just wasted our time.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing so many of these dangerous ideologies permeate the church, but they're kind of shrouded in these really good words like, social justice and equality, but they're really unbiblical. How can we as Christians discern these false teachers in the church and identify some of these really dangerous ideologies?
Well, Psalm 89:14 says, from God's throne comes righteousness and justice. Righteousness is the standard of right and wrong that is established by God. Justice is the equitable application of God's moral law applied in society. So one is vertical obedience, the other is horizontal relationship. And whenever you have the vertical and the horizontal, you're going to have the cross. So we always start with Ephesians chapter 2, which says God wants to create one new man, and that one new man, you can recognize it because they will be involved in reconciliation. So the way you know you're being serious about the conflicts in the culture is that you are visibly and verbally involved in reconciling things that have been historically divided. And so if all we're doing is discussing our division and not creating the windshield of reconciliation because we're living in the rearview mirror of our past history, then we will not be moving where God is moving. And if we're not moving where God is moving, we're moving by ourselves.
Yeah. What are some really practical ways that we can contribute to this unity? People who maybe don't have a big platform, didn't go to seminary, just, your average church-going Christian, how can we practically contribute to this unity?
Well, first of all, in your sphere of influence, are you a bridge builder and not a bridge burner? Are you seeking to build relationships across the aisle with other people without compromising the essentials of the faith, but you want to relationally demonstrate love, which is the decision to compassionately and righteously seek the well-being of another. And then we're trying to get churches to take the initiative, which we call the Kingdom Strategy for Community Transformation. And we're trying to get churches to come together in every community in America through our national ministry, The Urban Alternative. And this 3-point plan has 3 A's. First of all, assemble. Once a year, gather all the churches and their members together for a solemn assembly, a sacred gathering to re-invite God back into our midst. Second A is address. Speak with one voice about the issues facing your community from a biblical platform and biblical point of view. Thirdly is act, where you do something that benefits the environment that you're in. Seek the welfare of the city. So you adopt every school. You adopt the police precinct to become the bridge between the police and the community. Or we have a new initiative that's part of that called Kindness in the Culture, where you get every member of your church to get an act of kindness card. And where once a week they intentionally do an act of kindness, even to people who are different than them. And you pray for that person when you do the act of kindness. And after you pray, you seek to share the gospel with them. If they're not a Christian, you leave them a card with your church address on it so they see the church was doing something that benefited them in the name of God. And so that's an initiative we're sending throughout the nation to get churches engaged with their members across racial and cultural lines. Because unity is not achieved by having a seminar on reconciliation. It's achieved when we work together to be a blessing to somebody else. And when that happens, it's reconciliation in action and not in theory.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's hard to be bold for Christ, especially for young people in today's culture. There's just so much is coming at young people. How can young believers especially present the truth both boldly and whimsically in a culture that really doesn't want to hear it right now?
Well, there must be, I call it relevancy and relationship, that we must speak in the language that people are listening to today. And for that younger generation, social media and technology is going to be a driving force in how we communicate. I think we need to amp up how you can use that to share your faith, because now you're being relevant to the communicative the mechanisms that are relevant in the culture. But then it must be combined with relationship, so that because that generation is so relationally driven, we want to provide points of connectivity. That's why even the act of kindness, because they're so engaged in improving things in the culture, this gives them a tool they can use to make a difference while they're sharing their faith. So relationship and relevancy, I think, are the two things that we've got to be focused on if we want to win them back and get them involved.
Yeah. Fantastic. You know, Dr. Evans, we're seeing a lot of false teachers in the pulpit. We're seeing a lot of pastors fall, to sin, which is really unfortunate. And I think about in how James says not many of you should be teachers and preachers because of the huge responsibility that comes with it. My dad's a pastor. It's not always an easy ministry to grow up in. What challenge or word of caution do you want to give young people who are thinking about entering the ministry to realize that this is a really serious calling that cannot be taken lightly?
Well, I want to challenge them to stay tethered to the Word and their relationship to the Lord as their primary goal, because ministry can become a God within itself. It can become your idol. And when ministry becomes your idol, God is in the background, and when God is in the background, you become vulnerable. So I would say keep that dynamic to God's Word and God's person as a primacy in your life. And then have people around you who can speak into you with authority. Don't be an isolated Lone Ranger, because like a salmon swimming upstream, a bear can pick you off if you're isolated. So you want to make sure that you're in relationships that can be sustainable and that can be authoritative in your life.
Yeah, that's really good. Now, this book is dedicated to your wife of almost 50 years, Lois. And I want to ask how you're doing today after her passing.
Well, thank you very much. It's a big hole in our lives and in the life of our family, but a meaningful one, because she was so involved in every aspect of our family and of our ministry. And so we fight forward in the midst of that loss, because her good hand is still, her fingerprints still exist everywhere.
And what encouragement would you offer somebody else who may have lost a spouse recently or is in the process of grieving right now?
Well, I would say you must hold on to the character of God when your circumstances are not in your favor. Isaiah 40, the people said, what's going on in our lives is not fair. And God's answer wasn't to change their circumstances. God's answer was to talk about him. And he says, do you not know? Have you not heard? In other words, run back to what you know to be true about him. That may not always cooperate with your emotions at the moment, but it will provide firm footing as you keep going for what God still has for you.
Yeah, it's incredible. Now, just one more question. We're living in really turbulent times, right? We've got a pandemic. There's the invasion of Ukraine. There's so much uncertainty in the world. What word of encouragement can you give believers right now? Why can we still have hope?
Well, we can still have hope because one of two things are happening. God is allowing all of this chaos because he's setting things up for his return, which we will have then no control over. Or if he's not returning on the short term, then he's doing a divine reset and reshaping culture because he's been marginalized too long. He's upsetting the apple cart until we get back in line with him so that he can do something new. Either way, we're going to be better off.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Evans.
Thank you for having me.